Here, we'll watch
happened
Hakim's
to the
video on the
USSR.
collapse of the USSR.
There's quite a bit of mythology around the dissolution of the largest nation of the previous century. Every side of the spectrum has given their reasoning, with some being more believable than others. Here I hope to show the common arguments and hopefully help you reach your own conclusions. This video is a partial transcript based on the book Socialism Betrayed: Behind the Collapse of the Soviet Union by Roger Kieran and Thomas Kenny. I strongly recommend you pick the book up. It is by far the best study of the dissolution of the USSR that I've ever come across. Anyways, let's get into it. According to the book, these arguments can be broken down into 6 categories.
Bro put the suicide hotline on here. No, it's not. He didn't put it. Sorry. Fucking Google did.
Found in academic literature: supposed flaws of socialism, popular opposition, external factors, bureaucratic counter-revolution, lack of democracy and over-centralization, and the Gorbachev factor.
The Gorbachev factor. Also known as the Trumpian. Also, the modern version is the Trump factor.
Those that support the first theory think all strands of socialism, no matter how unique, are equally doomed to fail. Usually, they bring this down to the human nature argument, as flawed an argument as it may be, and appeals to the superiority of the free market. Those that support this theory, or variations thereof, include Martin Malia, Richard Pipes, and Dmitry Volkogonov. Despite the many achievements of Soviet socialism, the system did have many flaws during the 80s. Issues with consumer goods, slow penetration of computer technology, falling productivity, differing levels of corruption, and the notorious second economy. Problems extended into the political sphere as well, where overlapping party and state functions reduced local overhead and kept political initiative at the very top. Of course, many of these problems arise from a myriad of other issues like the Cold War, the relentless economic and other warfare waged by the US against the USSR, and the heavy burden of supporting allies abroad. The point, however, is that none of these problems were large enough to cause the fall of the Soviet Union. They didn't cause crisis, let alone collapse. To quote the book, "The trouble with this theory is that it views Soviet history as unfolding towards an inevitable demise because of its departures from human nature, private property, and the free market." Though these views gained ascendancy in the US during the Reagan era, few historians subscribe to historical determinism based on human nature. In addition, this theory is utterly incapable of explaining how Soviet socialism survived the collectivization of agriculture and the German invasion of World War II, only to fall apart under the seemingly far lesser challenges of the 1980s. Nothing makes this clearer than Sovietological work from the 1980s, which in full confidence considers the USSR to be a force that's here to stay. For a deeper dive, take a look at these 2 videos here. The second theory suggests that popular opposition to the Soviet system brought it down. Although no one explicitly holds this opinion, it's frequently cited as a major reason. They include things like intellectual dissidence, protests, the rise of nationalists, and the relative electoral success of non-communist officials in the latter era. This line of thinking isn't entirely wrong, as many Soviet economists did favor market reforms, and these opinions influenced that of Gorbachev's. Other examples include the Georgian and Azerbaijani protests, the upheaval in the Baltic republics, miners' strikes, and the unopposed activity of non-communist officials in high government positions. The problem with this theory is that popular discontent came up towards the end of Gorbachev's reforms, not before. These upheavals occurred in response to Gorbachev's policies. In clearer terms, those policies caused these issues. In the final analysis, popular opposition acted as a dependent rather than an independent variable, a byproduct of Gorbachev's policies rather than their cause. This is further strengthened by the prevalent resistance of the Soviet people against dissolving the Union, as in Chapter 6 of this very book. Albert Szymanski's work too here is relevant if you're interested in further reading. According to the third theory, external factors rooted in the Cold War and the global economy caused the Soviet collapse. Extreme opinions even go as far as to say that the betrayal of Soviet socialism was due to the CIA's penetration of Soviet leadership. Now, the extent of this penetration was far worse than you may realize. According to one later report, by 1985, the CIA and FBI had developed the most impressive inventory of spies against Russia in American history, and had riddled the KGB and GRU, which was the military intelligence, with moles. Still, unless further revelation.
Important to note that a lot of the reasons for collapse of the USSR are not present factors in China as it stands currently.
Shows that Gorbachev or Yakovlev served as CIA agents, it stretches credibility to suppose that the CIA brought down Soviet socialism. Nonetheless, external factors, more powerful than the CIA ever could be, were most definitely at work. The intensification of the Cold War in the early 80s, followed by the world recession in 1979 that made American presidents Carter and Reagan increase military spending, caused the Soviet Union to do the same in return. To quote the book, Soviet society never enjoyed the luxury of internal development free of the threat of outside aggression. The cost of defending itself and aiding its allies escalated yearly and drained resources away from socially useful domestic investments. By 1980, Soviet aid to its allies cost $44 billion a year, and our spending consumed 25 to 30% of the economy. The strain of the Cold War increased during the late Carter and early Reagan years. The doubling of military spending by the US, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is better known as Star Wars, the aiding of anti-communists in Afghanistan, Poland, and elsewhere, driving down the price of oil and gas on the world market, which was the Soviets' main source of hard currency used for trade, as well as engaging in various forms of economic and psychological warfare. Of course, all these played a significant role, but Francis Fitzgerald provides the most persuasive refutation of the supposed decisiveness of Reagan's policies at destabilizing the USSR. He argues that no clear cause and effect relationship existed between the external factors and internal crisis. For example, he states that increased US military spending under Reagan, for Star Wars for example, and other projects, didn't increase Soviet military spending directly. Many Soviet insiders likewise rejected the idea that the arms race caused either Gorbachev's reforms or the collapse. A Soviet official in military intelligence said, "The notion that Gorbachev's perestroika was started as a result of Reagan's Star Wars was concocted in the West and is completely absurd." A member of the Soviet Institute for the USA and Canada said, "I am deeply convinced that neither the Strategic Defense Initiative nor the arms race in general contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union." Regardless, all this misses the point. However great in whatever form, the external pressure coming from the United States represented less of an external threat than earlier economic sanctions, sabotage, and foreign invasion. More importantly, the external pressure did not dictate the particular shape and direction of the Soviet response. In the end, Gorbachev and similar forces' particular responses to the external pressures and internal problems provided the most decisive cause of the dissolution.
Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Atlas VPN. For a lot of research that I do for my videos, I end up hitting pages that aren't available. In the link in the video description.
A fourth theory is that the cause was a bureaucratic counter-revolution. The idea being that the bureaucracy itself became the base for
Chat, it's like a fucking 2-year-old video. The ad is no longer relevant.
a capitalist restoration, or that transformed itself into a new possessing class. This is more or less the arguments of Kotz, Weyer, Azad, amongst others, though some in this group didn't regard this new group as a class. Kotz and Weyer argue that the reform course launched by Gorbachev unleashed processes that created new coalitions that favored replacing socialism with capitalism, with Boris Yeltsin becoming the leader of the anti-socialist bloc. With the support of the party-state elite, quote-unquote, he was able to push aside two rival groups, the Gorbachev social reformists and the CPSU Old Guard. Essentially, the argument goes that the breakup of the USSR as a multinational federation occurred because of the specifics of the power struggle between the Yeltsin and Gorbachev forces. Yeltsin's anti-socialists held power in Russia, while the Gorbachev social reformists held most of the Union institutions. The Yeltsin forces concluded that they could maintain power and pursue capitalist restoration only by withdrawing Russia from the Soviet Union, hence the USSR fell apart. The bureaucratic revolution from above thesis is, however, not completely convincing. Such officials were, according to the book, incapable of collective action to defend the system and incapable of consciously hastening its demise. The top bureaucracy, if it can even be said to have enough substance to be judged an authentic social group at all, was too heterogeneous and scattered to act as a cohesive political force. Moreover, if the elite was capable of conscious independent action in its own self-interest, why did it back Andropov's Marxism and Leninism in 1983, Gorbachev's revisionism in 1987, and Yeltsin's free market shock therapy in 1993? This discussion is continued in the book. Klam Azad also supports the thesis that the bureaucratic elite fostered a counter-revolution. In his book, he offers a decent history of the accomplishments and limits of Soviet socialism, but argues that the real problems began with Khrushchev. The rapid consumption model and wage leveling adopted by the 20th Congress in 1956 sapped production incentives, created shortages, reduced economic growth, and fostered the black market and corruption. Khrushchev's ideas that the Soviet Union had begun the full-scale building of a communist society, adopted by the 21st Congress in 1959, was overly optimistic, sowed illusions, and led to further wage leveling and stagnation. The adoption by the 22nd Congress in 1961 of the idea that the Soviet state had become the state of the entire people and the CPSU a party of the entire people signaled a weakening of the party in regards to the state and a growing predominance in the party of intellectuals and bureaucrats. In short, Azad argues that the Soviet Union's problems and Gorbachev's policies were the aftershocks of the mistaken policies of the Khrushchev era. Azad treats the Gorbachev period as a footnote to Khrushchev's mistakes, a part of the hiatus of 25 years in failing to implement much-needed changes, as a direct quote. In the view of the authors who wrote the book, though, the real problem was not the bureaucracy as such, but the second economy that had corrupted sections of the party and state, fostered a petty bourgeois mentality outside as well as inside the bureaucracy, and turned some bureaucrats, along with the second economy entrepreneurs, into a base for Gorbachev's opportunism. The fifth theory argues that the Soviet Union collapsed because of a lack of democracy and an over-centralized administrative system. In essence, a similar view to the first explanation, with the difference being that instead of a critical flaw in socialism generally, it's only Soviet-style socialism which can be faulted. These types usually claim that the so-called lack of democratic institutions and over-centralization derived either from Stalin or Stalin and Lenin, depending on ideological persuasion. This view is widely held by left social democrats, Eurocommunists, the Demsoc crowd, amongst others. Historian Stephen F. Cohen and the Soviet writer Roy Medvedev also reflect this view, and so do many contemporary communist parties. This explanation is superficially attractive as it doesn't require any defense of Soviet socialism. To quote the book, to blame the Soviet collapse on a lack of democracy and over-centralization thus serves as a psychological or political distancing mechanism. It is a way of asserting that the socialist ideal remains pure and untarnished in spite of what happened in the Soviet Union. It says history does not matter. The actual experience of a socialist country does not count. The only thing that matters is what we supposed socialists or communists say today. What happened in the Soviet Union was there and then. This is here and now. Those Soviet communists messed up, but we're different and smarter. They were too bureaucratic, undemocratic, and over-centralized, but we either knew it all along or have learned it from their mistakes. As convenient of a view as this is for those who wish to get their time on the next lecture, book promotion, or media interview, it leaves a lot to be desired as an explanation. It's unfalsifiable, has essentially zero explanatory value when applied to real events, and lacks so much precision that it cannot be either sufficiently proven nor categorically refuted to the taste of those that hold it as an opinion. To say that the Soviet Union collapsed because of a lack of democracy and over-centralization can mean only one of two things. Either the collapse occurred because the Soviet Union lacked the political and economic forms and practices familiar in Western social democratically governed countries like Sweden, i.e. a liberal democracy and a mixed economy, or it occurred because the Soviet Union failed to develop a new kind of socialist democracy and mixed economy hitherto unknown anywhere in the world. Both ideas fail as historical explanations because they rest on idealist constructs that attempt to explain history by the degree to which it conforms or fails to conform to an ideal. Modern historians, Marxists or not, believe that historical explanations must adhere to the actual details and contradictions of history. This precludes understanding history by measuring it against some outside standard. Furthermore, this train of thinking, where the Soviet Union collapsed because it failed to follow European social democracy, have another problem to deal with. It's clear that after a certain point, Gorbachev shared the same ideals as those theorists and tried to move the Soviet Union towards a liberal democracy with a mixed economy. Yet those exact moves are what led to a political and economic meltdown that has still not been overcome. This is an embarrassment that none of the lack of democracy theorists have been able to explain away. Furthermore, these theorists ignore the actual history of liberal democracy and socialist democracy.
The real has no Pizza Hut and Pepsi is what led to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
For whom and in what form, for example, economic, deepens the nuance but is rarely discussed. Refer to the book for this discussion. It's long to render here, but it's very good. Regardless, there was an active effort within the USSR from the earliest period to develop ways to increase the participation and control by the workers and peasants, including broadening membership in the Communist Party and developing Soviets, trade unions, and other mass organizations. Though the process of developing democracy was far from over, the Soviet Union had developed a variety of political institutions and practices designed to provide popular participation. The Soviet practices included using newsmen and ombudsmen as well as news sources, vesting trade unions with power over workers' rights, production norms, and the disposition of social funds. Mick Costello's book is great on this topic if you're interested. Creating Soviets, production committees, community assemblies, governing committees of living complexes, and other party and government bodies. To quote the book, though many of these populist institutions atrophied during the difficult years surrounding the Second World War, they revived in the 1950s and involved greater and greater numbers of working people. Even under Brezhnev, popular participation in government showed many signs of vitality. Writing in 1978, when the Soviet Union contained 260 million people, a group of Soviet writers gave the following figures on Soviet political activity. 16.5 million communists, 121 million trade union members, nearly 38 million young communists, over 2 million Soviet deputies, 35 million people who work with the deputies in the Soviet's People's Deputies, 9.5 million members of people's control bodies, and 5.5 million members of production conferences of industrial enterprises. Of course, participation in a socialist Soviet, just as participation in a bourgeois election, provides no conclusive proof of popular control, but it nonetheless represented, however imperfectly, the striving for a kind of socialist democracy. Many of the traditional Soviet political forms, the newspapers, the Soviets, and the Communist Party itself, were undermined by Gorbachev after 1985. Thus, while the majority of Soviet people remained opposed to privatization of property, the elimination of price controls, and the breakup of the Soviet Union, the traditional modes of expressing political views were evaporating. What this means is that the lack of democracy theorists could have been right, but definitely not in the way they wanted to be right. Relevant reading can be found in my book recommendations video on the topic here. The final theory is that the Soviet collapse was mainly due to Gorbachev. Unsurprisingly, almost all accounts give great weight to Gorbachev's role, with some accounts going further than others. According to the British historian Archie Brown, the dissolution of the USSR was greatly determined by a Gorbachev factor, as he called it, mainly Gorbachev's departure from communist orthodoxy, painting him as a heroic westernizer of sorts. Jerry Hughes thinks that Gorbachev was a free marketeer. Evgeny Novikov and Patrick Bashio suggest that Gorbachev was a Gramscian Eurocommunist. Anthony D'Agostino argues that Gorbachev was a Machiavellian wanting to maintain power by any means necessary. Though the authors of this book agree with the common elements of these views, that
Gramscian Eurocommunist.
Gorbachev's ideological deviations played a key role, they nonetheless disagree with several other elements. Accounts that overemphasize Gorbachev obscure the extent to which he was not alone but operated in a historical and social context. When he first departed from Andropov, Gorbachev represented ideas that nonetheless had precedent in the communist movement, namely in the ideas of Bukharin and Khrushchev. These ideas had some appeal in Soviet society. These included the weakening of the central power of the party and the government, the legitimizing of private property, and allowing more freedom for markets, which had potency in the 1980s because they palpably reflected the interests of a dynamic, if parasitic, sector attached to illegal private enterprise. Thus, Gorbachev was both a successor of a certain tradition and the product of his times, not just a lone factor making history. Moreover, for some writers, stressing Gorbachev leads to them seeing his actions as part of a long-standing preconceived plan. The evidence, though, seems to point towards a shallow leader who acted rashly, impulsively, and contradictorily. Though his policies eventually formed a pattern of capitulation to the petty bourgeois, liberal, and corrupt interests at home, and imperialist pressure abroad, this was not evident at the start. Opportunism was his primary guide. In the end, the story of the Soviet collapse was not the inevitable unfolding of a tragedy rooted in an impossibility of socialism, nor was it a defeat brought about by popular opposition or foreign enemies, nor was it due to Soviet socialism's failure to match up to some ideal of socialism that embodied liberal democracy in a mixed economy, nor was it primarily the story of the conscious betrayal of one man. Rather, it was the story of a triumph of a certain tendency within the revolution itself. It was a tendency first rooted in the peasant nature of the country that later showed up in a second economy, a sector that flourished because of consumer demands unsatisfied by the first economy and because of the failure of the authorities to appreciate the danger it represented and to enforce the law against it. It was a tendency that
treats, simply put, a lack of robust manufacturing of treats. And then bringing in treats when it's far too late, but only bringing it in the form of private enterprise and liberalization of markets.
that manifested itself in Bukharin and Khrushchev before Gorbachev.
The treat factor is still important to address.
It was a tendency that believed that prosperity, democracy, and its vision of socialism could come quickly and without sacrifice, without struggle, and without strong central authority. It believed in making concessions.
Also, I mean, it's not even a joke. I do genuinely say this. I've said this for years. If you are a super old school Hasanabi head, you've heard me talk about this before. Like, one mechanism of control under neoliberalism is the bounty, the abundance of treats, and the accessibility of treats. Whether it is a false choice, the notion of choice is in and of itself a false one, because it's like still produced by like 8 corporations, regardless, does not matter. The fact that you can get treats is a major contributor to people's defense of capitalism. You've never said that before? Well, you're a 2-month subscriber, so, and you've been following since 2021, so you've not heard me say this. I've said it quite a bit. Treats are an incredible, commodity consumption is an incredible mechanism of control. An incredible means to sedate the masses in a peaceful fashion. And it is a necessity, because the government is supposed to do that in order to quash any sort of like serious popular uprising. You have to manage people's expectations. You have to make sure that they feel as though their conditions are improving. Accessible treats are a fantastic way of doing so.
To imperialism, liberalism, private property, and the market. Some adherents of this tendency believed that they were true socialists, though they allied themselves with others whose true sympathies were with money-making and private property. Not until Gorbachev had this tendency in the revolution held full sway and been carried to its logical conclusion. Only with Gorbachev was the full mistake of this course realized, when it led not to a new kind of socialism, but to a new kind of barbarism, to quote the authors. In the case of the Soviet Union, Fidel Castro said it best: socialism did not die from natural causes, it was a suicide. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please
cinnamon raisin bread and circus in your top 1%? Yes. You can either maintain control through authoritarian means and say, no treats for you. You can't demand treats. If you demand treats, that's counter-revolutionary behavior. Or you can maintain control by letting the treats flow. And then people think, oh my God, well, you know, cost of goods goes up every now and then. There's no upward social mobility, no means of having a better future. The American dream is such a dream and so unattainable that you must be asleep to even see it. Or, you know, do the authoritarian thing. Demonstrably, capitalism has the abundance mindset on lock. What about climate change and industry of trees contributing to it? Yeah, I'm not a degrowth guy. I'm just going to let you know. I've never been a degrowth guy, and I'm not a degrowth guy, and I will not be a degrowth guy. I think in terms of degrowth, the furthest I will push it is eradicating the planned obsolescence that's baked into the profit incentive. And I think that's valid. That is a necessity. Okay? In terms of how commodities are produced, or rather, what kind of energy that we use, yes, I am always in favor of renewable energies. But I've never been a degrowth person. Anti-degrowth, Hasan, is the first time I've disagreed with you in literally 5 years. What bucket does China fall under when it comes to trees? China is the most treat abundant nation, dude. You kidding me? China loves its trees. That's why I say China has American mindset. Yeah, China literally learned the lesson of losing a treat gap, and the CPC decided to be the best treat-making nation of all time. What do you mean? China loves its treats, and the Chinese love their treats. Treats are an absolute necessity. I'm an advocate for better quality treats. Better quality treats that have more of a shelf life. That's my advocacy, chat. That's what I believe. But you will not stop the flow of treats. So would you consider Cuba to not be a socialist nation? They planned out a 100-year environmental response, especially considering the direct impact from natural disasters. Wait, when did I say Cuba is not a socialist nation? What? If Cuba was allowed to operate within the global market, I'm sure that they would be much more, they would have trees that are much more readily available. What? China also has a renewable energy initiative planned and mapped out, and are focusing on sustainability. I'm not saying you need to. What part? Like, do you guys think I'm talking about, you know, destroying the planet? Like, I'm like, no, I want treats, and I want it in the current mode of production, the way that it's produced currently. Hyper exploitation of the global South. That's not what I'm saying. Better quality is inherently a part of degrowth. You're contradicting yourself. No, I'm not. I'm simply stating that toothpaste out of the tube. Okay, you can't tell people, like, you're just not going to consume. Degrowth is a scary concept for many, for understandable reasons. I don't entertain it. I treat it in the same way as I treat saying we must abolish the police force and abolish the prisons. We must abolish all prisons and the police force. It's like some semblance of policing as an institution will always exist and must always exist. I understand the theory, and I understand, as anarchists also agree on this process, that like there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get to that place. It's not like they want to abolish it tomorrow. Anyway,